Hey, deserving listeners. So many of you have contacted me or talked with me and told me that after listening to an episode of this podcast or listening to a different podcast or just reading something online, that you suddenly discovered that you had a mental condition that you have been dealing with your entire life, but just never had a word for it, or you were ashamed of it, or you were denying it. And then all of a sudden you realize, wait, this is a thing? I have a thing? I have borderline personality disorder. I have avoidant attachment style. Well, even more broadly, I'm a victim of abuse. I always thought that we just had a mildly conflictual relationship, but when I realize, learning this information from this outside source, I'm suddenly realizing that I'm a victim. Or, wait, I'm a perpetrator of abuse. Some of you will bravely tell me that you've realized that about yourself. Well, now it's my turn, y'all. I am going to tell you about how I discovered that I have a mental condition. Now, you might remember me talking about having mild dyslexia more recently. In the last, maybe a couple years, I've talked about it occasionally. And I don't remember when I made this connection or realization, but in my head, it was a few years ago. Maybe I talked about it specifically, but it doesn't really matter. But since then, I've been discovering new aspects of my dyslexia, things that I've always known about myself, but just never attributed to dyslexia. And in the last few weeks, maybe in the last week, I've made huge discoveries, just all of these connections to my life, all these seemingly unrelated difficulties and shames that I have about myself are in all likelihood related to this genetic neurological disorder called dyslexia that I have. And I've been saying I have mild dyslexia this whole time, but I don't know. And here's the other thing. I thought about doing a deep dive on dyslexia and related learning disabilities, but I thought instead I would make an episode when I'm at this point of my discovery, because I think that there's a lot that can be explored about the emotional experience of discovery and also what it's like for maybe lay people. Because at this point, I'm kind of like a lay person when it comes to dyslexia. I'm certainly not an expert, and I have a lot of questions. And I think that for y'all, you might be, at times, either in the past or now or in the future, in this emotional space. If I waited and researched and prepped and did an episode, I feel like my enthusiasm or my astonishment would diminish. So I just want to, I'm still I realized something just now, just like a minute ago, as I was sitting down to record this, and I'm like, oh my God, there's another fucking thing. So let's get into it. My name is Dr. Kirk. I'm a therapist and a professor, and I have, I think, moderate dyslexia. I don't have severe. And that's the other thing I want to say is that I know that I do not have a severe case. I know that I don't have a severe learning disability, as evidenced by the fact that I managed to find a number of workarounds. Not to say that I haven't suffered and that I haven't had a problem, but I know and or highly suspect that further down the spectrum, that if I had a greater case of dyslexia, then my life would be much different, because it really would have hindered me. So I just want to say that up front, that I am not talking about a severe case. So I'm not representing at that end of the spectrum. Some of you might be on that end of the spectrum, and as you hear me talk, you're like, well, you don't have it that bad, so stop complaining. Yeah, I don't think you'd say that, but I just want to say that up front. So the first thing I should mention is that my dad has always said that he has dyslexia. I never saw the effects of this, but he has stated that, and I should ask him how he was assessed or what his symptoms are. I know I've talked with him about it, but from my memory, I think he says that he has trouble reading things and the words kind of get jumbled up or something like that. But it runs in families, of course, dyslexia. So I should mention that. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of symptoms is reading slowly, because this is the symptom or the experience that recently in the last few years alerted me to the possibility that I had dyslexia. So let's talk about that first, just this element, because there's other categories of symptoms, but in terms of reading, I've always read very slowly and very poorly. In the first grade, if that's pretty much all we did. We barely did any math, or the math that we did to me was so easy that I don't really remember doing math in first grade. But I do remember reading, and I remember that groups of us would sit around a table in the back of the classroom and we would read these very simple books out loud. And I remember feeling like I was dumb, because when you're a kid, you just don't know where you fit in. And I remember thinking, oh, I must be kind of dumb. I didn't think I was like super dumb, but I definitely didn't think I was smart, And I would I have distinct memories later in grade school, like second grade, third grade, fourth grade, where I don't know if you did this in your elementary school, but it was a very common activity in class for, I don't know how many kids are in a class, like 25, 30 kids. And we would read a chapter out of a book, and each of us would take a paragraph. And the paragraph could be 3 sentences long or longer or shorter, but it wasn't very involved. And we would just start from the first kid in the left row, and they would just snake our way through all of the desks that we're sitting at. And I would like seriously sweat that, and would really worry as it was getting closer. I'd be like, right from the beginning of the activity, oh shit, okay, well, okay, we're gonna read, instantly high blood pressure, and then as it got closer to me, I would figure out what paragraph I was going to have to read, and I would stare at that paragraph trying to like prep, and it would never work because I'd be freaking out, and plus my dyslexia would make it so it'd be hard to I don't know how to describe it, because people will talk about dyslexia as words or letters being jumbled up. I remember that's the way it was described to me. I don't think people describe it that way anymore. But from my understanding at this point, that's not actually what happens. The individual with dyslexia perceives everything as reality, right? When they look at the words, it's the same vision or the same picture in their mind that everyone else has. It's just that it's hard to comprehend it or to quickly decode the vision into concepts. Recently I was talking with Bob on the podcast, and he said something that I actually didn't know that other people had. I always knew that when people read, with people, without dyslexia, when they're reading a paragraph, past a certain age, they don't read individual words or individual syllables, right? They will just understand the word without having to sound it out in their head. I knew that much, but what Bob said, and I've learned recently that a lot of people have this, is they don't even perceive the sentences really. It just all gets subconsciously automatically downloaded. Their brain is perceiving all the letters and all the words, but it's being I don't know how to describe it. It's being processed in this very quick, automatic manner where the whole word is being comprehended, but not only the whole word, but whole phrases of words are being comprehended. It's sort of like the way that when I am driving on a route that I know very well, I don't have to think about, okay, make sure that you turn here, and it's all just automatic as I do it so often, and I don't have to think about every single move. I think that's, I don't know if that's a good analogy, but I didn't know that. I didn't know that it was that beyond what I do, which is I literally sound out every syllable. Like if I have a word, I'm looking at my notes right now, like the word dyslexia, I see dis and lex and ia. I when I'm reading it, I go dyslexia. And I actually read out loud in some ways faster than I read in my own head, because if I read out loud, I'm forcing myself to sound out all the syllables, and I'm also not skipping ahead, because if I read in my head, my brain will want to go faster, and so I'll just blow past a bunch of words, and then I will realize at some point, sometimes mid-sentence, that I wasn't actually slowing down. And that's the other thing, I think I always thought it was because I was impatient, or at least that was part of it. But that's not it. I'm also impatient at times, but my reading problems doesn't have anything to do with impatience. It has to do, I guess you could say that I need to be more patient because of my disability. But anyway, so where was I? Oh yeah. So in the third, fourth grade, I am reading in class, and really, while I was taking the notes, I thought of a common mind-boggling fight or flight experience that I have. So I'll be at the university or in various other contexts that I feel very comfortable in, by the way. But if we're going around the room introducing ourselves, I will break out into a cold sweat, and my heart will start pounding, and my voice will start to shake. Part of it is just stage fright that I've always had. I have a pretty severe case of it. And maybe because of reading. Actually, golly, because as a kid, the amount of times that I'd be on the stage, and the reason why I was on that quote-unquote stage was because I was reading, was probably high proportion anyway. But another aspect of that I think triggers me is that we're going around the room in sequence, right? And it's coming up on me. It's coming up on me. And then I freak out and say stupid shit. And, this is me at a university that I've worked at for 25 plus years, and I'm program director at times. I'm very comfortable there, and yet when or if someone were just to call on me and say introduce yourself, I'd be fine. But it's something about watching my turn coming soon. Anyway, I don't know if that's related to dyslexia or not. I clearly have some sort of stage fright. But anyway, so I remember having that experience. And until a few years ago, I just would have said, well, yeah, I just read slower than other people. And that's good that I could acknowledge that. But I did not appreciate just how much of a disadvantage that I had, and all the other effects that came from it, right? So as I was growing up, I wanted to, my friends and classmates would start reading literature, right? Starting in the fourth, fifth grade, there are kids that start reading serious books. And there were easy books to read and harder books to read. In the late 70s, you would have Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, or you would have Beverly Cleary or Judy Blume books, this kind of thing. And I always wanted to read these books. I loved the stories that were in it, because at the time there wasn't. It's hard, if you're younger, especially if you're significantly younger than me, it might be hard to visualize this, but in the 70s, there was very little programming and entertainment geared towards kids. A lot of our entertainment that would be very scantily and briefly aired on the 3 channels that were available to us over broadcast were actually really old things, like Bugs Bunny and Leave It to Beaver. These were things that were from my parents' generation or older. Mickey Mouse, this kind of stuff. And so, and even of that stuff, it was hardly ever. Now, fast forward until the mid-'80s. By this time, I'm a teenager, right? And now you got like He-Man and G.I. Joe and that kind of stuff. But in the 70s, there wasn't. You had Sesame Street, and you had Electric Company, and you had H.R. Puffin stuff, which I don't want to get into. but it was only on Saturday mornings for a few hours, and then golf would start, or football, or something would start at noon, and so reading was the only way to explore stories, and so I really wanted to read like my friends would. And I remember that in the 3rd grade, my really good friend Greg was reading the Narnia books, and I had read or heard enough about them to really want to read them too. And so I remember it was 1980, which would be was that 4th grade for me. So I'm 9 years old, and I remember Mount St. Helens erupting, and my parents were actually visiting my older brother in Japan. He was an exchange student for a year, and my parents went to Japan for 2 weeks. And my parents never left town, like ever, but they left, to visit because my brother was like a junior in high school at the time. And so I remember I spent a week at my friend Greg's house, and I spent another week at my Auntie Carol's house. But anyway, I'm at my friend Greg's house, and it's like spring break. There's no school, and so we're like, what do we do all day? And one of the things that we would do is we'd sit down and read books. And he would. I just remember it was one of the first times I noticed that like he would read so much faster than me. It's one thing to be in class and there's an assignment to read a chapter or a few pages, and for me to fall behind. That was one thing. It was another thing to watch him read like an entire book in a day. Meanwhile, I've gotten maybe 10 pages into the book, and I'm like, what? I'm asking, did you comprehend what you read? He's like, yeah, And I'm like, because the Narnia books, they're not long and they're pretty easy to read. But I just was astonished by that, and just I didn't know what to do, and I didn't tell anyone. I probably should have told someone. I don't know if anyone would have helped me, but this was, from my memory, the first time where I really started to be ashamed of it, and I would try to hide it. I would even hide it from myself. I didn't want to admit it to myself. And another thing that happened around this time was my parents were going to an open house in the summer for school, and my parents had heard that all the smart kids were reading Lord of the Rings. And they came home, and I remember my parents sitting down with me and saying, you need to read more. And I was like, oh, okay. And my dad really loved Lawrence of Arabia, the book. And so he gave me that book. And they also had heard that all the smart kids were reading Lord of the Rings. And so my parents gave me my older brother's copies. And I was like, okay. And, I was on board. But Lord of the Rings is not what even fourth graders should be reading in the first place. It's too... it's not a very entertaining read. The movies are entertaining, but the books aren't written as... I don't think Tolkien... In fact, he'll say he wasn't trying necessarily to entertain people. He was trying to document what he kind of felt was a mythology of of England or Britain that that other cultures would have, and he was trying to document his language. He loved languages, and so some people say that he was just writing those books because he just needed a story to entertain people, but really what he was trying to inject into people's minds was his various Elven and Dwarven and other languages, Numenorian languages and stuff. Anyway, but my friends were reading those books. I don't know how much they were enjoying them really, but I sat down to read those books, and it was demoralizing. There's too many names and places and too many descriptions of meadows and brooks. I mean, there's just, it's arguably not recommended that adults read these things. You know what I mean? This is coming from like a massive Lord of the Rings fan, which I am. But I, and around this time, I discovered Dungeons and Dragons. It was starting to become just barely enough popular that I had heard about it and loved it. And that's the other thing, is the Dungeons and Dragons books, which are written for adults, but they're not written very well. I really wanted to learn how to play D&D, and reading these books, looking back, I wish I could go back and tell myself in the 5th grade and 4th grade and say, look, it might be really hard for you to comprehend what's in this book because it's not written for kids and you have dyslexia. So you might have to develop some workarounds, which I eventually did acquire, which I'll get into later. But again, I was ashamed. I, at some point, gave up trying to understand or get through The Lord of the Rings, but I didn't tell anyone about it. I would tell people that I had read The Lord of the Rings because I understood the broad strokes of the story enough to play along, I mean, it's not like the topic came up very often, but if you would have asked me in the 6th grade if I had read The Lord of the Rings, I'm guessing I would have said yes. I wouldn't have elaborated on it, and I wouldn't have said I read all of it or comprehended all of it. But anyway, so I distinctly remember that. And around that time, I just drifted away from literature and said, again, this is all kind of like in denial. I don't think I ever told myself that I have a problem or it's hard for me to read, because it felt like if I admitted that, it would be a defeat, or that I would be admitting I'm dumb, or I'd have to. I mean, I think the way that I interpreted it was that I wasn't putting enough effort into it. A lot of people with learning disabilities, whether it's dyslexia or something more comprehensive like ADHD or something, that it's a very common narrative that's told to us, but also just one that we come up with ourselves, which is, I'm lazy. And I think that's basically what I was telling myself. Anyway, so there's a lot of things that happen in high school, but I'll get to that later when I talk about writing and specifically not just reading. But in college, it would take me forever to read course material, whether it was my bachelor's degree or my master's or my doctorate. And I had all these workarounds. One, I would skim, because if I just read the way normal people read, my brain would be so overtaxed about 2 pages in that I would want to give up. So what looking back, what I did is I read every single syllable, and I would zero in on certain paragraphs that seemed more important than others, in academic, textbook writing. And I had, a mechanical pencil, and I would notate all over the page. I'd underline and circle, and I had all these like symbols that I developed over time in the margins. I had circles and stars and lines and checks and minuses, and I believe why I was doing this was because it's easier for me to understand something and remember something, and it's easier for me to find it if I need to refer back to it if I have like all these symbols. The symbols like help me to understand or to read it. I don't know how to describe it, but and maybe for you that know more about dyslexia than I do, you know what I'm talking about. You're like, oh yeah, of course, that's this thing that people do. But I don't know. This is just me at my current understanding. So fast forward to late 90s, early aughts. I'm about 30 years old at this point, and I have effectively given up a long time ago on reading fiction in particular, and just reading in general. And but I haven't admitted it really to myself. I'm not saying it to other people. I'm a professor by this point. By this point, I'm a therapist, and I have a lot of friends who live in literature or writing or academia, and to admit that I'm just lazy or I'm not cultured enough to read books, it was hard. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but I just couldn't, face it. So I'm just drifting along. But I remember I was at my parents' house, and my mom said that she had been listening to the Harry Potter books on audio cassette. This is before CDs were standard in cars. And at the time, I was a therapist, and I was driving all over. I was at in-home. A good portion of my private practice was doing in-home therapy. And I spent a lot of time in the car driving because my clients could be, several miles from each other, And if you're familiar with the Seattle area, there were times when I was seeing clients like south of Tacoma, and then later that day I would have clients on Vashon Island or in Everett or something, or all the way out in Black Diamond or Falls City. I was all over the place. And it was better than working at an agency because of the work and the pay and everything, but it meant that there was a lot of driving, and I had a lot of time to just listen to stuff in the car, right? And this is before MP3 players and podcasts and everything, so I'm mainly listening to talk radio and NPR, and I really loved it for that reason. I didn't realize that I absorbed it and appreciated it more than other people, because it's kind of like, it's like instead of reading a newspaper or a magazine, I'm listening to radio shows and This American Life essays that is at least in the same ballpark as a magazine or a newspaper, if that makes any sense. And I've never been able to absorb that kind of stuff and to get it in the oral sense, to hear it, to, get it in the audio. I just soaked it up and just really loved it. And when my mom said that she was listening to Harry Potter, I asked to borrow the tapes after she was done. And so at that point, book 4 had just been published. And so she gave me books 1, 2, 3, and 4. And another reason why I wanted to listen to it is because I was working with kids at the time, and they all had the Harry Potter books in their bedrooms, because I would go into the house and I would notice that there was a lot of Harry Potter books around, and I was like, what's going on? Anyway, so I'm listening to the Harry Potter books on audio cassette, and I'm just blown away at, especially the first book, at how wonderful the book is, how entertaining it is, and how it can do things that movies can't do and TV shows can't do, And I'm like, oh my God, audiobooks, who would have thought? Because I don't think I had known that they existed before that. So I started checking out audiobooks from the library, because audiobooks back then were really expensive. They were like I don't know, maybe like $50 or something. And, that's just way too much money. So I would check them out from the library, but they didn't have a lot. And I remember at the downtown Seattle, the brand new, downtown Seattle fancy, it's this very cool looking glass building with weird floors on the inside. Anyway, and I checked out Cool Hand Luke. I don't know why. I'd never heard of the movie with, what's his name? Was it Robert Redford? No, the other guy. Anyway, you know who. He was in that movie, but it was based on a book. So I'm listening to the book, and it's just Cool Hand Luke is just about a guy who is incarcerated in the South, and he's just going through these experiences, and it's anti the man and all that kind of stuff. And it's not really up my alley, but I loved it. I was like, oh man, give me more of this shit, because I, like a lot of people, enjoy literature, enjoy fiction, but had given up a long time ago. And I remember I checked out Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, another book that isn't necessarily in my wheelhouse in terms of subject matter, but man, did I soak that thing up. Pillars of the Earth, I remember, and also the first Game of Thrones book. So I had been recommended it in around the year 2000-ish. And, this is way before the TV show came out. And he's like, oh, you got to listen to this. And I remember I listened to it in the car, in between clients. And I hated it the first time I listened. I was like, there's too many goddamn names. This is so dumb. But then I was like, I'll give it another chance. And I started over, having already absorbed some of the names on the places. And that gave me enough of a head start that I loved it, but I didn't read the Game of Thrones book. I listened to it. And when people would ask me if I had read any books, I would say, yes, I have read Game of Thrones. Yes, I have read Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, but I hadn't, quote unquote, read it. I had listened to it, but I wanted to be accepted as a real human being who reads books. And so I don't know if you call it a lie necessarily, because, if people asked more information, I'd say, oh, well, actually, I listened to it, and there's various different takes on this. But at the time, I don't think it's so much today as much as back then. But back then, audiobooks were seen as like a cheat, like you were lazy or it wasn't really reading, But to me, it's as close as I can get, because if I just sat down to read Game of Thrones, like it would take too long. I would get too frustrated. I would need to like be on my. I would need to be like super energetic, which can work. Like if I'm really happy and really energetic, and I have all the energy in the world, and I sit down to read a book, like I could probably do it better. But the typical average energy level of a day, it's too much effort in my brain, and I just, But anyway, so I was suddenly like, wait, there's a hack. I can listen to these books. And I'll tell you something that I don't even know if I've even admitted this to myself until now. But I'll take a break and I'll tell you afterwards. All right, we're back from the break. So when the Lord of the Rings movies came out, and I think the first one would have been the year 2000, right? Maybe 1999, somewhere around there. And I was so happy that a proper movie producer had made the movies, because when I watched them in the theater, for the very first time, I understood what the books were about. I mean, so I had read The Hobbit. I did manage as a kid to get through The Hobbit. I only comprehended the broad strokes, like simple scenes like the barrel scene or the spider scene or the trolls scene. But the Battle of the Five Armies and the Arkenstone stuff and Thranduil and all that stuff. I was like, huh? Like it just didn't. I just couldn't understand it, and maybe I was just too young, or I needed to read a companion explainer. Or I don't know, but I basically understood The Hobbit. Plus, there was a fairly good cartoon movie version of The Hobbit in the 70s, early 80s that I watched and understood the book even more. But with Lord of the Rings, there were some cartoons out that, there's a famous one that like only got like halfway through the book and then ran out of money or something, or the trilogy. But I still didn't really understand because the movie cartoon version, it just goes so fast and doesn't really explain anything. So I had been saying that I had read the books, and I had basically read the books, but I didn't understand the books. But and for most people, whatever, right? But for me, I lived the lifestyle of a Lord of the Rings fan. I played Dungeons and Dragons all the time. I probably thought about hobbits and Númenóreans and elves and dwarves frequently. I would have conversations with other nerds about Aragorn and Arwen and Elrond and whatnot. But I didn't really understand because there's so many story beats in the Lord of the Rings when you really think about it. There's so many different little stories within the story, right? And there's also these broad, because the Battle of the Pelennor Fields outside of Minas Tirith, when I read it as a kid, it's just so hard for me to understand. Plus, I just didn't understand like battle tactics in the medieval time. When they talk about like different kinds of, armor and battle rams and stuff. Like I just didn't understand. Back then they didn't have Wikipedia or anything, and so you're just like, what's that? Oh, move on. Anyway, so when the movies came out, I secretly was appreciating that someone finally just told me what was happening in these books that I was basically faking that I was a part of this whole time. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's not like it came. It's not, I don't appreciate liars, and I don't lie. I guess you could say that I was kind of lying by omission in a sense. But let's just say this: that I was happy to have people believe that I understood the Lord of the Rings, since the time that I quote unquote read it at the age of 10, and I'm now 30 years old at this point, and I'm just like, I'm not, well, let's put it this way. I never told anyone back then. I didn't tell anyone, by the way, I didn't really understand the books until I saw the movies. I mean, that's disgraceful, right? It's like, what kind of a dullard are you that, it's like you need pictures, so, this is another, I guess I just realized another aspect of this is that, as y'all know, I'm really into movies. And one could argue that to varying degrees, we all have this desire to consume the hero's journey and to hear about adventures abroad or about experiences that aren't our own. And a lot of people get that through literature. I could not. And when I discovered how movies could give this to me, I really leaned into the movie thing, the way that people talk about books, I only, people will talk about books and movies and TV shows, but all my energy goes into books and, anyway, you get my point. So yeah, I watched the Lord of the Rings movies, and of course they're great movies, and loved them, and they seem to get better every year as other crap gets made, especially in the Lord of the Rings universe. And you're just like, my God, like those Peter Jackson movies were so good. And you also just think about other Peter Jackson stuff and how it sucks, like King Kong and the Hobbit, quote unquote trilogy, and how terrible that was, and you're just like, man. Those movies are so good. But But I walked out of those movies because people would turn to me and say like, "Oh, these are great movies. You must have known all this stuff, right?" And I'd just be like, "Yeah, I read the book. I've read the books on and off since I was a kid." And meanwhile, I'm just in the dark as everyone else. But I was ashamed. I thought there was something wrong with me, and then I would try to cover it up, which additionally made me feel like something was wrong with me because I was hiding. It's not only something to be shameful of, but the hiding you're also ashamed of. You're ashamed of your goddamn fucking shame. Now, some of you know this forwards and backwards. I'm talking about a fairly narrow part of my life, that didn't dominate much, but I'm realizing all this now as I'm talking. So then podcasts start to come out in early aughts, mid-aughts. And once again, I take to it because it's spoken text or it's, maybe a little bit more casual, these early podcasts, but they're essentially the sort of content that in previous decades you would read about in a magazine or a newspaper or a publication or a book or something. And now you have experts and other people just talking about it, and I could listen to it. At the time, I thought I loved podcasts because I was doing this in-home therapy and I'm driving all over Kingdom Come, which is also true. But another part of it, I think, is that I was finally gaining access to an intellectual discourse that I always wanted to hear and comprehend and absorb, but just couldn't. And so I, loved these early podcasts. The podcasts that I would listen to were mainly about science, astronomy, and other physics and chemistry, and other boring stuff that probably bores you but excites me. And I would listen to psychology podcasts as well, and that's what led me to think about making my own podcast. And if and there's a lot of aspects. It's like, why would I start this podcast 16 years ago? Well, I've always had my various different explanations for that, but I think an additional one is that I loved podcasting so much because of my dyslexia being a barrier to this kind of thing, that I wanted more and more and more of it. And at the time, there wasn't much like I remember you could probably scroll through all of the available podcasts like in 10 or 15 minutes. There's no way you could do that today. There's millions upon millions, and every minute there's another 1,000 that's being added, right? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. And back then, there was so few podcasts that I would run out of podcast episodes to listen to. Whereas today, it's just like, there's just no way. On my phone, there are so many podcasts that I want to listen to, but just don't have time, Anyway, like my wife, Stacy, she listens to the Dax Shepard podcast, the Armchair something or other. And I remember listening to the first few episodes way back and liked it, but I just never have time. The Conan O'Brien podcast I used to listen to religiously, but I just don't have time with that one either. And it just starts filling up the memory on my phone. But anyway, so one explanation for starting the podcast was that I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to be as close to podcasting as possible. I'm not going to write a book and make an audiobook. I'm not going to write a screenplay but I can participate. I guess now that I think about it, let's say that we all have a desire or varying desires. Well, let me put it this way. Everyone in academia has, in all likelihood, a desire to put their ideas into a package. And traditionally, that would be writing a journal article or an article for a magazine or a dissertation or a textbook or a chapter in a textbook or whatever. Like there's a lot of, obviously academics love this shit because they do it and they don't get paid for it typically. If the average academic, and I'm not talking about like the sort of academics where it's like you publish or perish, that sort of stuff. You could argue you do get paid for it because your salary and stuff. But a lot of my colleagues, they write because of their passion. And I had that passion like anyone else did, but because of my deficit and my learning disability about reading, which also applies to writing, which I'll get to in a second. And I'm sorry for rambling, but that's the nature of where I'm at right now. I guess part of this is also just a little bit of a therapy session for myself. So I thank y'all for that. But I had that desire. And when podcasting came out, that part of me was like, wait, so I don't have to write anything down? There's no reading or writing. I can just think and then talk and, take some notes and have things prepared, but I don't have to string it together into an academic format or a narrative format, which was, especially at that time, really, really hard for me to do. And I'm like, so it's interesting to think about, right? That I started the podcast partially because of dyslexia. Because dyslexia doesn't hinder me as a podcaster very often. Whereas other academic or professional or creative pursuits, my dyslexia would make it so it'd be impossible to do. Anyway, so another aspect that I just thought of before pressing record was, since starting the podcast, increasingly as I became more popular, people would ask me for book recommendations or article recommendations, and it still happens to this day. And God bless, if you want to know, go ahead and ask. I don't have any book So here's the thing: I would tell people at first that I would just make up an excuse when people would ask, or students might ask, right? Or clients might ask. And I just never knew what to say. And they always seemed to expect me to have several book recommendations. And I always thought that the question was odd because I just don't live in that kind of mindset. But I would see colleagues, other therapists, professors, and podcasters for that matter, who would at the ready have several book, if you listen to Rebecca episodes, you will hear her immediately have, just off the top of her head, a number of book recommendations. Someone will email in and say, do you have a book recommendation for raising a trans kid? And Rebecca will be like, yeah, boom, boom, boom. And she'll have the title and the author and, just right at the top. And I was always impressed by my colleagues that could do that. I was like, well, it must be because I'm lazy. It's always that. It's never, I wonder if there's something different about me. It's always, there's something wrong with me, right? I'm lazy. And eventually, over the years, I was getting so, upset about not being able to answer these questions from the podcast listeners that I developed a page on the website that had all of the, I systematically took the time to go through a lot of books that I had read or at least had. So when I read academic books, and I don't know if other people do this, and maybe they don't, but I don't read it from the beginning to the end, right? I have to skip around because if I just sit down to read something, my brain will run out of juice, or I'll read a whole page and not really understand what I'm reading and then have to go back. Anyway, maybe everyone does that with academic. But the point is that I developed this book recommendation list, and that list hasn't really changed in probably 10 years, maybe 7 years or something. But I would always just route people to that page. And if some of you were ever routed to that page, you probably were not satisfied because that web page doesn't have a lot of useful stuff on there. But I didn't know what else to do. And the fact is that I haven't read many books. I've read bits and pieces, and I have read research, not from front to back, but, the relevant bits. And I've, talked with a lot of people, and I've received a lot of consultation and supervision, and I've listened to a lot of podcast episodes, but I haven't read a lot of books, and there are a lot of books on the thousands of topics that I have touched on this podcast that I could at least be aware of, such that I could recommend them to people for further reading. But I don't have it because I don't read. I avoid it in terms of reading books. And, for me to have a book recommendation, one, in all likelihood, I would have started my research process by gathering books and just reading through the entire book, right? And then I would have that at the ready. Or at the very least, as I'm doing prep, I would get these books and I would read them. And then I would, because that's the other thing, when people would ask me for book recommendations, I would have books that at least of the portion that I had read, I would say, yeah, those are good, but I hadn't read enough of the book to endorse it. Maybe there's whole sections of that book that are atrocious. I don't know, but I don't have enough time or energy to read all those things. And so when people would ask me for book recommendations, I would hide the fact that I hadn't read. And so for future reference, don't ask me for book recommendations because I don't have any, or it's not likely that I will. And I understand that other people, live in that world, but I can't. So, all right. So this was my first realization a few years ago that reading was hard for me, that it took me longer, that it was harder for me to comprehend. It took more energy. So I've always known that I read slow, but a few years ago, or maybe even a year ago, recently, I was like, wait, there's a condition that is related to that, reading slow. And I don't just read slow, I read pathologically slow. It's dysfunctional. It's not just slightly slow. It's problematically slow. And I was like, wait, maybe I have dyslexia. Wait, my dad has dyslexia. Wait, do I have dyslexia? Holy shit. And then the journey has just been ever, increasing on a parabola until today in the last week, when I made a bunch more discoveries, which I'll go over in the next part of this podcast episode. Let's take a break. All right, back from the break. Again, I want to thank you for being my collective therapists right now as I just sort of process this all out loud, which I haven't really done. I've talked with, on the podcast about it at times, and sometimes at length. And I've talked with Stacy mainly about this, just oh my God, there's this thing. But this is probably by far the most that I've processed everything out loud. And so I thank you for that. And I apologize if it's all kind of jumbled up all over the place. Anyway, so I came across this screener online on the website for the International Dyslexia Association. And they have an adult screener questionnaire. And when I took this about a week ago, some new discoveries were made because I was like, wait, that's a thing? Okay. So I just thought I'd go through this and maybe you can play along. The number one item here is, how would you compare your current reading speed to that of others of the same age and education? So it has
above average to below average. And I wouldn't say I'm the worst, but I'm definitely below average, but I'm not far below average because I just have mild dyslexia. Number 2, how much reading do you do in conjunction with your work? So this is interesting because I do a lot of reading in conjunction with my work, but reluctantly. But that does say something, right? If I had a greater case of dyslexia, I either wouldn't have been attracted to academia or I wouldn't have succeeded in academia. So I have to admit that there's a great deal of reading in my job. So is that. Okay, number 3, how much difficulty did you have learning to spell in elementary school? Okay, so they have from none to some to a great deal. I would say that it was some. Spelling is a problem for me, but it's a problem for a lot of people who don't even have a learning disability because it's there's a lot. English is bizarre. I before E, except after C, except a neighbor, and it's hard to remember that stuff, and it's common that we use spell check to help us to spell those things. But before I forget, so another discovery that I thought about in the last few weeks is when I schedule things, I am a very organized human. I'm not saying that as a brag. I'm saying that as just a fact. I love being organized. I love planning it ahead. I love organizing things. I love putting things in neat little organized packets. When I plan parties, I plan everything down to its little, the invite list, and I remind people to make sure that they, and I'll tell people months in advance that a party, save the date, and we're talking just like normal dumb Halloween party stuff, not like a wedding. And yet I'm just like, well, might as well schedule that. Like with the anniversary live stream, I schedule that 9 months, 10 months in advance because why not? Every year there's an anniversary and you might as well lock that down as soon as possible, right? I just love that kind of stuff. So I say all this to demonstrate that I'm very practiced at scheduling things on a calendar. And when I am scheduling things for myself or with other people, I'm emailing or I'm writing in my, I have my own Gmail or Google Calendar. I will text people and I'm very elaborate when I schedule so that there's no ambiguity. I'll say Saturday, November 5th at 7:15 p.m. I'm one of those people, and I write it all out. I don't abbreviate anything so that everyone is very clear. And yet, many times, I will jumble up the dates when I am emailing or texting someone. So I'll be sitting there going back and forth about, okay, how do we schedule this or when do we schedule this? And I'll get it all locked down and everything's fine. And then the last step is to inform the others or to schedule like a live stream on YouTube. And that very last step of, okay, now I'm informing people, something happens where all of it gets jumbled in my head. I'm looking at the calendar and what I'm visually perceiving is like, November 5th, Saturday at 5. But my brain can't comprehend it and it jumbles it up. So it's like November 3rd on a Wednesday at 5 p.m. And then I will email that or text that to someone. And then I just move on with my day and bad things will happen. Just a couple of weeks ago, the reason why this occurred to me was because I was trying to schedule a live stream for a particular day, but I scheduled it for the wrong date and time. And like 5 minutes before I sat down, or I don't know, maybe an hour before I sat down to do the live stream, I figured out that I had done it wrong. And it was upsetting on a number of levels because I was essentially lying to the audience and saying, I will have a live stream at this time, but it's actually scheduled for a different time, and I didn't show up for that different time. So I feel really horrible when I do that to audience members because I want to be dependable and reliable. So that was humiliating. But also, I was worried that no one would show up in the live stream. I'm like, well, I kind of have to do the live stream now, but no one's going to be there because I told them the wrong time. And so I'm telling Stacy, I'm like, well, even if there's no one there, then I guess I'll just lecture about something, but I'm going to do it anyway because I said I was going to, and I deserve to punish myself for having messed that up. And then it occurred to me, wait, is this also a part of dyslexia? And of course it's a part of dyslexia. I mean, some of you might say, well, I don't have dyslexia, but I do that sometimes. I'm telling you, I know enough about myself to know that I do this, and I'll stare at the calendar and I'll be typing it in and I'll be going slow and I'll still fuck it up because my brain processing can't hold on to it all without jumbling it, mixing up words, So I just wanted to just mention that before I forget. All right, going on to another item here on the International Dyslexia Association screener. How would you compare your current spelling to that of others your age? Oh, we already went over that. Oh, no, that's a different question, but related to spelling. How would you compare your current spelling? I would say I'm not above average, but I'm a little bit above average, because, of the same age in education. I would just say I'm average, same age in education. Number 5, did your parents ever consider having you repeat any grades? No, they never considered that. Do you ever have difficulty remembering people's names or names of places? Yes, and on a Likert scale from no to a great deal, I would put myself kind of in the middle of that. I mean, it's not severe, but I have noticed that people, I have to work really hard at a party if I'm being introduced to people, and even when I am using techniques like someone will be introduced to you. This is Timothy, and hi Timothy, and there are techniques of remembering where, as you're talking, you just repeat in your head, Timothy, that's Timothy, 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 the tall one, Timothy tall, curly hair, Timothy. You just keep doing this. Even when I do that, I still will forget people's names. I know it's common to have this happen because I think all of us, it's just hard to remember in a situation like that. So I don't know if that's related to dyslexia or it's just normal life, but I would say I have a slightly greater difficulty than other people. Okay. Number 7, do you have difficulty remembering addresses, phone numbers, or dates? Okay. Oh, so when I read this item last week, I popped out of my chair and ran into Stacy's office, and I was so giddy to tell her the following. So Stacy and I have been together for a long time, and she has had basically the same phone number this entire time. And there have been times, because Stacy is a worrier. She worries. I worry too, but she really worries. And one of the things that she worries about is like, what if you lose your phone and you don't have access to your phone book and you need to call me from someone else's phone or from a pay phone or something? You don't know my phone number, do you? And I would say, yes, I do. It's D, and I would always get it wrong. And the way that I remember phone numbers is graphically. Maybe everyone does this, but I'm pretty sure that my dyslexia makes it so that it's harder for me to memorize a phone number. And a workaround that I've always done is I see the the on a keypad when you are like the phone number I grew up with, my parents no longer have. So I'll just say that the way that I thought of my home phone when I was a kid, what our home phone was 392-6986, and on a regular keypad on a phone, the 789 was on the bottom, whereas on a keyboard on a computer now, often the 789 is at the top. So just kind of think about that. But so it would be 3, it would be the top right, and then you jump down, and then you go back up. So it's like a little isosceles triangle, 392. And then 6986 is all in this little equilateral triangle at the bottom right. So that's the way I thought about it, were these two triangles. And I thought about like the vectors. I don't know if everyone does that, but I did that. And with Stacy's phone number, I had these triangles and these swirls memorized, but I never knew which numbers they were associated with. And I every once in a while this would come up, and I would kind of joke around about it, like, yeah, your number is this, right? And she'd be like, no. And I'd be like, oh, well, sorry. But I would try, I would try. Okay. And when I would look at the number, 90% of the reason why I was trying to memorize her number is just because I wanted to, it felt like forgetting an anniversary or something, like it felt unromantic. Like I didn't care about her. I don't think she interpreted it that way, but I think there was a slight that. And so I did try, and I would try, but I would keep forgetting. And I guess I'm sure if I really dedicated myself, like every day I woke up and memorized the number, I would have eventually had it locked in. But, given that we don't dial phone numbers anymore, we just press on a name on our phone, it doesn't give me the opportunity to memorize a number. However, Stacy, she knows my number forwards and backwards since the first time or the third time she called me or something, and she's never had to, I don't know if she's ever had to dial my number, right? So she has had no problem memorizing my phone number, and I've felt like a bad husband this whole time, but now I have an excuse, y'all. So I jump up and I run into her office, and I'm like, the reason why I don't know your phone number and I can't memorize it is because I have a learning disability. So stop oppressing me. Just joking. I didn't say that last part. I don't know if it's related. Maybe I am a bad husband, but I think that's it. Because it's always boggled me why everyone else can do that, or most people can. You're not going to find people memorizing all the numbers, right, in their phone, but they'll remember the key ones, like their spouse, and especially when they put their mind to it, right? And yet, I still am only 90% sure that I know her phone number. Anyway, so do you have difficulty, going back to the screener, do you have difficulty remembering addresses, phone numbers, or dates? I would say that I'm not as bad as I'm guessing what other people are like. Well, now that I think about it, I will forget my own address. Like, my current address. I have these workarounds, like these mnemonics that I follow because I've thought that I remembered my own address, and I would write it down on a form or something. And then I would stare at it and I'd be like, that doesn't look right. And I would say, no. And then I would write what I think it might also be. And I'll be like, no, that's probably what it is. Imagine that, y'all. Imagine not knowing your own goddamn address. And that's something that you write down all the time, because when you're buying something online, you got to fill in your address. I mean, there are forms now on your browser that will autofill and that kind of stuff. But still, it's like forgetting your own phone number, which I also will forget at times. but I have to see the triangles in my head. Anyway, so I have these little reminders to tell me, it's sort of like spelling the word friend. I learned when I was a kid that friend ends with end, the E-N-D. And every time I write friend, I say that in my head. And I'm guessing a lot of people are like that, right? But I'm that way with my address and my zip code. I have to, and I've filled it out wrong. And then realized it later, like, oh crap, I filled out, I put my wrong, I just realized that. Yeah, I forget my own goddamn address. So I'm going to put myself at like a 4 out of 5 on that one. Do you have difficulty remembering complex verbal instructions? I would say no. Do you have current reverse? Do you as I'm reading, so this is another thing, like reading out loud, which I'll get to in a second in terms of, well, I might as well talk about it now. So when on the podcast, I will respond to emails, right? And when I am even reading the emails, particularly if there's more than 3 or 4 sentences, because typically people email in some pretty complicated questions, right? Well, what I do, and I think I've said this on the air, but I'll get the email and it'll be paragraph form, right? And I have to spend all this time in a Google Doc or in a Word doc organizing everything into bullet points. And not just like stale bullet points, but I have all these different levels of the bullet points, because if someone emails in and says, hi, Dr. Kirk, I have a question about my attachment style. Some background. I grew up with it. Okay, so I will have hi, Kirk on the bullet, and then I have a question about attachment style, and then background, and then everything below that I will indent. You know what I mean? It's just it's intuitive. It's the way that bullet points are used, but I need to do this not only to comprehend the email and to keep my eyes focused, but when I read them on the air, I need this. Otherwise, I will lose where I'm at. If it's just, if I just read your email the way that it's sent to me in a paragraph form, I will lose the thread. Like my eyes will, it's almost like everything goes blurry. It's not really blurry, but at times particularly if I'm a little taxed brain-wise, then the whole paragraph will just kind of become one big blurry mess, and I'll realize it'll happen, and I'll be like, wait, where am I? And then it'll kind of erase everything that I've read thus far, and I'll forget what I read, and then I have to go back to the beginning. Whereas if I do the bullet point, if my brain does that sort of metaphoric blurring, it's much easier for me to find where I'm at and with the bullet points, because it's graphical, it's geometric is a good word for it. When you look, and the bullet point email will take up 5 times the amount of space in a Google Doc than just a paragraph, right? Because I'll also bullet point phrases within the sentence to keep my eyes comprehending things. Like if someone says, I do this in a number of ways, like when I'm at the store, or when I'll give when I'm at the store its own line, and when I'm at home its own line. I'm guessing other people don't need this because they write and read in paragraph form. It's really hard for me. It'd be possible if I was just casually reading, but if I need to read on the air, and as I'm responding to the email, my eyes have to kind of jump to different parts of the email to respond to different parts. I cannot do that if it's in paragraph form. It would. So I've always known this about myself, but never thought of it as dyslexia related, and it might not be because I'm in the early I think that it is. But I always just thought of it as, I just really like bullet points. Or you know what? I think really if I thought about it, I just never wanted to think about it, because if I thought about it, I figured there would be something to be ashamed of in there. And so I just would quietly and privately do all these different things and just sweep it under the rug. I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of, right? But I think I just figured there must be something shameful about this. Do you know what I mean? It's weird. But I do that. And related to this, when I wrote my first book about, it was about supervision, a lot of the book, the initial draft that I thought was pretty fucking good, which it wasn't, a lot of the book was bullet pointed. Things that aren't usually bullet pointed. And I would bullet point it, and I thought, hey, this is my book. I'm going to design it the way that I want it to look. I don't have to conform to conventions of writing. And I wrote it bullet point, and I gave it to some colleagues, and they nicely told me that I need to get rid of the bullet points because it was so weird. And it also broke the flow, and also came across like just a bunch of lists instead of actually explaining something, And I reluctantly went, okay. So I remember like the second draft or, a later draft, I did break out some of the bullet points, but I retained many of them. And slowly with each draft, I would discard more and more of these bullet points. And now in the supervision book, there's hardly any compared to the beginning. So this is another aspect of like of these workarounds that I have and just kind of fell into, right? So that's my bit on that. But anyway, do you currently reverse the order of letters or numbers when you read or write? Again, I don't think I'm that bad, but I would say that, I don't know, on a 5-point scale, I'm probably in the middle. I don't know, maybe that's exaggerating a little bit. I don't know. Okay, another question. How many books do you read for pleasure each year? 0. And then, the top one is more than 10. How many books do you read for pleasure each year? None. I'm trying to remember the last time I read a book, not listened to, but actually read a book for pleasure. And I read, it's a graphic novel. I read a graphic novel of Watership Down recently and cried many times because I just love that book. And I did read the book when I was a kid, and the book is easy to comprehend when I read it as a kid because it's told from the perspective of rabbits, and so it's not super complicated. It's not like Game of Thrones where there's 10,000 people and places and names and stuff. But anyway, I'm trying to remember the last time I read a book for pleasure. The last book I can I remember reading, like an actual book, not a graphic novel or a short story or something, would be a book, the Adventures of Drizzt from a Dungeons and Dragons book. I can't remember the name. Well, the book's right behind me. What's it called? Because the few books that I've read, I actually have the Dark Elf trilogy, and it's a D&D book. It's one of the better ones, written by R.A. Salvatore, I think. But I read that book 30 years ago. And if you look in the book, I have all these notations everywhere to help me comprehend and remember. Because that's the other thing. It's not just comprehending language. It's also remembering language that can be a problem for people with dyslexia. Anyway, there's got to be an actual book in the last 30 years, but maybe not. That tells you something, right? And I want to consume stories. And now ask me how many audiobooks I've listened to for pleasure in the past year. I would say dozens. Anyway. And by the way, I listened to, most recently when Stacy and I were on a road trip, we listened to the Steve Martin or did I talk about this? Yeah, I already talked about it, I think. Anyway, okay, another question. How many magazines do you read for pleasure each month? 0. Do you read daily newspapers? Never. Do you read a newspaper on Sunday? Never. I mean, this is kind of dated because I'm guessing a lot of people, but some people do for sure, right? Even if it's online, right? But I don't. Which of the following most nearly describes your attitudes toward children when you were a child? Which of the following most nearly describes your attitude towards school? So my brain is literally mixing up words as I'm reading to you about a screener of dyslexia. Okay. Attitude to school. Okay. Loved school to hated school. I actually loved school. So that tells me that I had mild dyslexia and that I was not bullied or shamed or held back or hindered or something, particularly once math and science became more emphasized than reading, because I have an affinity for those subjects. And it was then it was around fifth grade when that was starting to happen. And I remember thinking, wait, because they tested at the end of fourth grade what tier you would go into, right? And there were 3 tiers. There was the normal tier, and then there was the high tier, and there was the low tier. And most people went into the normal group, but I tested into the AP advanced placement tier in all the subjects, including English, which is weird, which I'll get into in a second. Well, I'll talk about that now. So I don't know why I tested into advanced English. I'd be so curious. I don't understand. I'm racking my brain trying to think, how did I get it? It must have not involved reading fast. The screening must not have involved reading fast or writing much, because when so the first AP Advanced English class that I took was in 9th grade, and it was a very hard class. Miss Martine, she was very tough, and an Asian lady who married a white guy, so she had a white guy last name, and she was beloved by us advanced English students, and we respected her, but we feared her, and we complained about her because she was very hard. Incidentally, Brian Yorkie was in this class with me. It's actually when I first started to become friends with him. He's the guy who would go on to write a Tony Award-winning musical called Next to Normal, and he also worked with Selena Gomez on 13 Reasons Why and other kinds of things. Anyway, so he was really good at writing and reading and understanding and all that stuff, and sitting next to him was intimidating. But really, sitting next to all my classmates was so. I'm doing okay in the class, but I'm not particularly good. But I remember this repeated experience in this class, in that the teacher, Ms. Martine, would assign us to write an essay every now and then, right? Maybe every other week. She would typically assign it on a Friday, and it turned it in on Monday. And I remember this like it was yesterday. There were so many moments writing these various papers that are combined in this one memory. I would go home and I would sit on my bed because I didn't really have a desk, and I would be writing this paper, and I knew from the assignment that the essay had to have 5 paragraphs. Now, that was the bare minimum. The rest of the class probably had whatever number of paragraphs they needed, right? But the teacher was like, I need to have this minimum level so that people don't turn in 3 sentences, So it had to have 5 paragraphs, otherwise it didn't count. And I also asked, well, how many sentences is the minimum for a paragraph? And she said 3. So I needed 15 fucking sentences about a topic that if you just asked me, I would yammer for a while about. But when you asked me to put it onto a paper and I would write with erasable ink pen. I remember I loved this new invention or this new product because before they didn't have this. In the mid 80s, they came out with a pretty good, ballpoint pen that you could erase. And so I'd sit on my bed and I would just stare at the page. And, given my issues, I wouldn't ask for help. I didn't even think to ask for help. I should have asked for help. But at the very least, I would just stare at the page. And I had the heart, and looking back, I don't know what the assignments were, but they were probably so simple. It was probably like, we read a chapter of Huck Finn, write, I don't know, your reaction to it or something. It was probably not very complex. And I would just stare at the page, and then I'd wake up the next, and I wouldn't get hardly any work done on Friday night. And then Saturday, I'd wake up, and I'd sit on my bed, and all day, I'd just be staring at this piece of paper and, maybe getting a sentence or two, and then erasing, and then all day Sunday, writing this 15-sentence monstrosity of a quote-unquote essay. But I would finish it, and I would bring it to school, and I would turn it in, and I would not get a good grade, but I would pass. And I'll never forget, I'm sitting in history class just before advanced English, and I'm sitting next to my friend Tammy. And, we're talking, and I'm like, oh, did you write that essay that's due next period? Because we had history and advanced English together. And she was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that assignment. And I'm thinking, oh shit, you're doomed. But she takes out a piece of paper and she just writes the essay in the history class in 10 minutes. And her essay is 10 times longer and better than mine. And I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, what magical power do you have? It never occurred to me that there was something wrong with me. I just thought, she must be a goddamn genius. Maybe other kids are geniuses. I don't know. Sweep it under the rug. Sweep it. Don't ask for help. Keep your head down. Fake it till you make it. Mask yourself. Act like you know what you're doing. You're not an imposter. You're worthwhile. You're a good student. Now, I got an A in the class. I don't know how. The teacher must have been nice. There are other things that you get graded on, right? Besides just these. I just can't imagine how bad these essays were that I wrote. So that's an interesting element to this, right? that I've always known about, right? I've told that story, maybe even on the podcast occasionally, but at no point did I ever, and I would say eventually I'm a terrible writer, but I would never conclude maybe this is part of a bigger problem, and maybe that problem is called dyslexia. Anyway, another item here. How much difficulty did you have learning to read in elementary school? I would say out of a 5-point scale, I was like the 4-point. Well, maybe the 3-point, because I know that there are people that had it much worse than me. I don't think I had classmates that I knew of. I mean, maybe I did, and they were ashamed too, but I've subsequently learned that for some people, it's like really, really hard. So I don't want to claim that I was even close to that, but so I'll put myself in the middle there, meaning that I did have some issues, but it wasn't nearly as bad as other people. How much extra help did you need when learning to read in elementary school? I didn't really need any help. Did you ever reverse the order of letters or numbers when you were a child? I must have. I must, but I don't remember. So I'm going to put myself at a 2 out of 5. Did you have difficulty learning letter and or color names when you were a child? I would say no. I did not have that problem. How would you compare your reading skill to that of others in your elementary classes? I would say I was way below average. And it was noticeable. Like, I was the worst. I remember I was the worst when it finally would get around to me, when all of us would be taking our turn. I would stutter and have to start over and just stop in the middle of a. I mean, part of it was anxiety and stage fright, but another part of it was I just couldn't. There's so many things of the neurological processing and perception that have to work well or within normal limits for a fourth grader to put their eyes on small print in a textbook and say it out loud in a fluid manner. You have to perceive the words fast enough such that your brain has enough time to comprehend what the words are, or at the very least know how they sound. Then you have to use a different part of the brain to tell your mouth to say the word, and for your brain also to kind of notice the word, right? And then you have to articulate the word. All that has to happen, in a split, fraction of a sentence for every word on the page. If there's any, muck in the machine, then things are going to get mucked up, and they did for me. Anyway, another item. All students struggle from time to time in school. Compared to others in your classes, how much did you struggle to complete your work? I would say not at all. I didn't. I mean, generally speaking, I didn't struggle. Although, when you say like the essay, I did. But, across all subjects, all assignments, it wasn't hard for me. Did you experience difficulty in high school or college English classes? I would say yes, a great deal. But probably not as bad as others. So I'm going to say I'm more like I'm probably exaggerating. So I did get an A, so I'll put myself a 3 out of 5. Like, in some assignments, yes, it was really hard for me, but I'm guessing others it wasn't. What is your current attitude towards reading? It's not, so it's like from very positive to very negative. I would say sort of in the middle. It depends on what kind of reading, right? How much reading do you do for pleasure? None. I don't do any reading for pleasure. Okay, so that's the end of the screener, and it puts me as having significant risk of having dyslexia. And it doesn't give me the exact number that it rated me. But anyway, so I think there's 3 different levels. There's like no risk, moderate risk, and significant risk, something like that. And so it says reading disability constitutes a very common learning disability affecting approximately 5% of the United States population. Reading disability is characterized by slow or effortful reading, difficulty sounding out new words, and problems with spelling. The results of this questionnaire indicate that you have experienced some or all of these symptoms. If your reading skills are interfering with occupational educational success, so one of the things that I have worked on, because of the podcast mainly, is I've worked on how to read out loud. I can actually now read out loud fairly okay. I would say I'm not awesome at it, but I can read out loud pretty well enough anyway, as I just demonstrated as I was reading that bit there. But I remember at the beginning of this podcast 16 years ago, really struggling. I would stutter, and I would have to edit a lot because it was embarrassing and was also just not good content to be constantly stuttering. So I have learned, and this is true, that the brain is plastic, and there's a lot of things you can do to work on other skills that are involved in reading out loud to make up for the deficit that gets in the way, So I think that's another data point that I have mild dyslexia and that I can overcome it to some extent. Now, I guess maybe if I read more, I could read faster if I worked on it. But that's kind of harder for me to do because, well, I don't know. I don't know if I want to get into that. I don't really know what to say about it anyway. So just some other realizations. I realized, I think when I was talking to Bob on the podcast, that idioms have always been a problem. I've known that. Well, I think I discovered my idiom problem when I was making reaction videos more. And because I'm talking off the cuff in these reaction videos, I'm always just laying the tracks out before me as I am going down the tracks. That's an idiom, right? And I will find that idioms are often called for and are helpful as I'm trying to convey ideas. And I will almost always, so I'll have the idiom in my head. The idiom is there, right? But as it is coming out of my face, it gets all jumbled up and it sounds really goofy. And then at some point, I started to just say out loud, I'm bad with idioms. But before making reaction videos, I don't think that I knew that about myself. And it's possible that dyslexia is a part of it. The way that I can look at this is comparing myself to other people, in that people in my circle have probably had exposure to the same set of idioms that I have had, and they've been exposed to those idioms to the same degree, right? Not exactly, but you figure, right? That because idioms are just things you just hear people using, and then or read, right? And then you repeat them, right? And so when I compare myself to other people in my circle, I'm a lot worse than they are at quickly recalling and spitting out an idiom, right? I'm not terrible at it, but I'm below average. Another detail is crossword puzzles. Crossword puzzles are hard anyway, but I would say that compared to other people at my education level and at my age, I would say that I'm far below average in my crossword ability. But I also avoid them, which makes you worse because when you do them more, you get better anyway. But I don't know. It's just another thought I'm wondering about. And then the last bullet point in my notes here is speaking. So I don't know, but from my little bit of research and reading about the possible neurological underpinnings of dyslexia and the symptoms and some of the more rare, or at least more rarely talked about symptoms, there's a little indication of this, so I'm not quite sure. But one of the things I've noticed about myself for a long time is that I speak slowly unless I try not to. And I don't know when I realized this, but I've realized that my parents are like that too. I don't know if I realized it at this point that I'm going to point to, or if I always knew about it, but when I really learned it was, I've had my mom and dad on the podcast. Well, before I did that, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I did this project where I had my parents over individually, and I would go over photographs from their childhood and those times, and I would ask them to just tell me stories, and I would record. Very much like a podcast episode, but they were not meant for publication. They were just meant for my own documentation of family history and just getting to know my parents better, this kind of stuff. And I still have those. And I even told my parents I wouldn't share it with my siblings, not to keep it from them, but I just wanted them to feel like, look, this is just a conversation between me and you, and I'm not going to share it. And if I do, I would ask you if I could, that kind of thing. Anyway, and I took the recordings. So as I'm going through the recordings, I edit the podcasts pretty thoroughly. I probably won't edit this one very much, but typically I edit out a lot of the silence, a lot of the dead air, and I will edit out a lot of the ums and the stutters and this kind of stuff just to make it easier to listen to. And with my parents, I was doing that as well. And what I noted, and so over the years, the 16 years of doing the podcast, I have learned how to edit, the spoken word very quickly. I can actually identify ums just by looking at the waveform. I don't have to hear the to know that it's an So I can edit out ums without even listening to it, if that makes sense. And I've gotten very, half of what I do on this podcast is editing out ums. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but like for every hour of recording, whether audio or video, I will spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours editing it for various different reasons. And one of the reasons is that I'm editing out silences and ums. And when I was interviewing my parents, I had all that experience behind me. And when I would look at the waveform of my parents, particularly my dad, but my mom as well, I saw an inordinate amount of silences and an inordinate amount of stutters and an inordinate amount of ums. And, my parents aren't broadcasters or public speakers, so God bless. But looking at the discrete waveform and editing out, like, no joke, like 80% of the waveform because it was either silence or fits and starts of sentences that don't go anywhere, or ums, or various different vocalizations that people do when they're just trying to keep the needle moving. And I realized, my God, my parents speak really slowly, especially when they're talking about something that is complicated, like their history. And I thought, that's where I get it from. I got it from them. Now, maybe it's just style of speech. Sometimes it's cultural. But I wonder if both my parents have some learning disability or difference regarding language processing, and that affects how quickly they can speak. And along these lines, for myself, similarly in other areas, that the podcast has honed my skill. When I started this podcast, I would really speak slowly and with a lot of ums and likes and knows, and I would listen back to the episodes, and I would put a lot of effort into not doing those kinds of things and to try to speak quicker. And with practice makes perfect. And so I think that I've developed enough skill overall to surpass the problems and to overcome it, to mask it or to make up for it or something. But when I started out, it was pronounced. And I think this is another tick in the column that if I do have dyslexia, it's fairly mild, because if it was worse, I think. But I don't even know if this is a part of dyslexia. It could be just a style of speaking, or it could just be another difference in learning or a difference in brain processing, or it could just be just normal variation of humans and how fast they talk. I don't know. But it made me wonder. It makes me wonder. And it also, I suppose, is a hopeful vision, is, especially if you have moderate or mild learning disabilities, is that with practice, you can make up for a lot of the deficits. It's not that you can't do it. It's that it's harder to do it. And the it is not necessarily only involving the learning disability. Like for me to be able to read out loud, my dyslexia, without any workarounds, would really create a barrier. 20 years ago, or I don't know, 15 years ago, if I was to read out loud, it would be really, really, really hard for me. And I probably wouldn't succeed in the slightest, and I would get through it because I would eventually get all the words spoken, but it would be all jumbled, and I would speak slowly, and I probably wouldn't retain any of it because I would be focusing too hard on like just getting the words out right. But over time with the podcast, I have inadvertently and somewhat vertently, somewhat on purpose, trained myself to become better and to work on how I can do that in other ways, setting up the bullet points and having a certain circuitry in my brain that I can slip into as I am reading, just having more of a flow to it. And over time, I am able to do it well enough and not let the disability stand in the way. Not that the disability isn't still there and is still dragging me behind a little bit, but I'm not doomed, like with writing, for example. When I was in the 9th grade, I was far below average. I don't even know why I was in advanced placement, honestly. I just don't understand. Or I was good in other areas of English, but not writing. Anyway, but with practice, there were some major leaps, and they were forced on me, one of which was my dissertation when I was getting my doctorate. And I had to, in order to graduate, I had to learn how to write well and how to write long form, because dissertations are, long, hundreds of pages sometimes. So I would work really hard, and I would, work on several drafts, and it ironed out some of the wrinkles in my writing process. Then fast forward a few years later, and I am working on getting our program reaccredited, and it's completely 100% on my shoulders, partly because it was foisted on me and because I just wanted to do it because I don't ask for help in life. But I would have to write a lot for that, the self-study and everything. And again, I had to iron out a lot of the wrinkles of the brain processing involved in thinking and writing, and then reading drafts and rewriting. Then a couple years later, I'm writing my book on supervision, and that really ironed out a lot of my wrinkles. And then when I was writing my book on grief and other kinds of writings that I've written over the years, I've just gotten better and better and better. Like when I think about that first draft of the supervision book, I laugh at it and think, what was I thinking? But I just, at that point, hadn't ironed out those wrinkles, and it looked fine to me, or it looked as good as I was going to get it. So my point is that with the space and the support and the opportunity and the drive, one can work on these things. Again, I don't have a severe case, so I'm not saying that my story is applicable to everyone. I can imagine there would be people with severe dyslexia, and virtually no matter what they do, it doesn't improve, at least much over time, So I don't want to foist that shame on people if they have worked on it and it hasn't improved. But yeah, so I just wanted to blab and get that all off my chest and explore that and model to y'all about something that I think we all do from time to time. You know what? And the final part of this is I'm 53 fucking years old. How in the world has this escaped me? And it'd be one thing if I was an engineer, but
I'm a goddamn therapist. I've studied learning disorders. I've assessed. I'm trained as a psychologist. I have administered the instruments and the measures to determine learning disabilities for adults and kids. How is it that it just goes to show you that, well, what does it show you? That we're not geared typically towards acknowledging this sort of thing, because it's like, why hadn't this question been raised for me? I can't imagine. Well, you would, in today's world, I'm assuming that it's true that teachers would have noticed something and would have at least raised the question earlier on. When I was a kid, as long as things were within normal limits, they're not going to necessarily think of you having an issue of any sort, right? Yeah. And of course, the shame and the sweeping under the rug and denial and I'm still kind of wrestling with it. Like, talking about all this right now, it feels vulnerable. It feels like there's this question rattling around in my head of like, do you really want to tell people that you have this problem, that you have this learning disability, that are people going to think that you're dumb or deficient, or are they going to tiptoe around you like, well, I don't want to email Kirk because I don't want to stress his deficient brain out. It's a weird thing. Of course, I all those questions and worries are unfounded and not helpful, and even if they were relevant, it's not my fault that other people are going to stigmatize me, right? That's the stigma's wrong. I'm not wrong. But it's hard to shake. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to this. People with ADHD, people with other learning disabilities, people on the autism spectrum, people who just for whatever reason didn't do well in math, or they just had low motivation in school or whatever. And you just, given our culture and our stigma and what we value and what we hold up, and, me being a therapist and a podcaster and an academic, a professor, I feel like I need to always at least be not the dumb one and at best the smart one, because if I'm not, then I'm a fraud and no one will listen to me anymore, But that's all silly, right? But I say all this to say that if you have those kinds of thoughts, I say all this to say that I have them too, and it's hard to resist their pull. It can intellectually feel, or intellectually I know that those statements don't make any sense and are harmful in my head, but yet there's a part of my heart and gut that are saying, well, it's kind of true, right? You're admitting that there's something wrong with you. You're admitting that you're not the genius that people might think that you are. I'm not saying people think I'm a genius, but however smart people think I am. And that's where I'm at. Intellectually, I understand those are all silly things. But there is some reality to that. You can find people who will say intellectually that, no, you having dyslexia doesn't cause any difference in my respect for you, that kind of thing. But in their heart and in their gut, they have lost respect for you, even though they don't want to, So it is a bit of a worry of mine, I guess. I'm not necessarily asking for reassurance. What am I asking for?
If you have a similar experience with dyslexia, I'd love to hear it. Or a similar learning disability, I'd love to hear it. Email in, use the form on the website. And everyone, please take care of yourself. Oh, tomorrow is election day. So I don't know what advice I have other than what I plan on telling myself, which is to try to put things in perspective and monitor my own distress level and do what it takes to relieve distress if necessary. And all that sounds obvious, but I think for a lot of people, they feel like the answer is to consume more and more news or something, which if overall that's not helpful, then at least for me, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to monitor all of that for myself. Yeah. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really, really do.